If you will, open your Bibles to Colossians. I had Mike read Colossians chapter 1 through 16, because it connects in a lot of ways to Colossians chapter 4, which is what we're going to be studying today. You guys might have noticed, or maybe you remember, that we were trying to go through Colossians. And we had gone all the way through chapter 3, and it has been quite a while since we've come back to Colossians. So in a moment, I'm going to try and jog our memories a little bit about, what's been going on in this book. So, apart from the objective of trying to go through Colossians and simply see the message that it has for us and the lessons in the book itself, I have had a little bit of an agenda. Hopefully, I have been a little bit successful in just trying to show you guys the value of studying a book within its context. As in just going through a book and just reading it and seeing how the connections from chapter 1 apply to chapter 3. How about the connections from chapter 2 to 1 and 3 and 4? Trying to see the similar veins of thought and the themes that run through one single book and just appreciating it without opening up a concordance, without going to other places in the Bible to try and find a deeper meaning or explain the passage. Let's just look at what the book says. And that's been kind of my goal going through Colossians in the way that I've been trying to teach it. The reason I've been doing this is because growing up I had some kind of notion that in order to really have a valuable Bible study experience, you needed to have like a concordance and a thesaurus and a dictionary, and you needed to know, if you were studying through something and you came across the word holiness, then you needed to run to that concordance and see everywhere in the Bible where holiness is mentioned so that you can actually get a good grasp on what holiness means. But more and more, as I come to read the Bible and as I come to slowly get more familiar with it, I've come to appreciate just reading through chapters and books instead of just looking at verses. Understand the context. What is the writer really trying to get through to us? Those are the kinds of things that you want to see when you're reading the Bible. You want to see the big message of how a verse fits into the idea that is trying to be communicated to us, the reader. Maybe as a bit of a fun illustration to this idea, let's look at a passage in Matthew 13 for 1 second. I don't have anything against using a concordance. I use one fairly often. And I don't want to come across as saying that you can't ever look at all of the different verses that have the same idea or word in it and learn to appreciate the words. I think concordances can be very, very useful. But at the same time, they're a tool. And they have to be used correctly. And so I just want to show you one simple, easy mistake that can happen if you rely too much on a concordance. If you go to Matthew chapter 13, and you're reading through it, and you come to verse 33, and Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 pecks of flour until it was all leavened. And you read that verse and you're kind of scratching your head and you're thinking, like, what what does this mean? And so you're not entirely sure what it means. Maybe other references in the Bible could help clear this up. And you see in the concordance that it points you to Luke chapter 12. And so you go to Luke 12. And you read in verse 1. Under these circumstances, after so many thousands of people had gathered together that they were stepping on one another, he began saying to his disciples, first of all, this is Jesus, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. And so here we have the same idea. It's leaven, right? And so without thinking, you just kind of go, okay, well, leaven, it could be the same thing in both of these contexts. I mean, it couldn't really be two different types of leaven. And I know he says beware, but really maybe the idea when you combine these two verses is that, the kingdom of heaven, you need a little bit of hypocrisy. I mean, we're all hypocrites to an extent, right? I mean, no. That's not the conclusion that you should draw from that. And so I'm just trying to draw, in a simple illustration kind of a way, that there's a lot that can be done with a concordance that shouldn't be done. And there should be caution to that. And that's part of the value of just reading through a book and working through it and studying books, not verses. Is that you're not going to make as many of those mistakes. You're going to understand where the author is coming from and what he wants you to know. So anyway, that's just a little side tangent, and something that I've been trying to show to you guys through Colossians is just the beauty and the connecting threads and veins running all throughout Colossians and how beautiful it is. Another reason why it's good to study an entire book, not just verses, is that it really does help you remember what the book contains. When you have a story, Barry Kercheval talked about this when he was here. Maybe I'll be able to refresh your minds a little bit. When I say, does anybody want a peanut? Does that maybe flip a little bit of a switch in your mind? Yeah. For those of you who have seen, it's from a movie, The Princess Bride. Fact is, though, if that quote didn't belong in a movie, you wouldn't know it. It's because there's a story attached to it. I mean, your mind goes to Fezzik the Giant, and he was one of the henchmen of. But the point is that when you understand a whole story, it's easier to remember the characters in it. It's easier to remember the parts of the plot. It's easier to remember what happened at what point in the story. And that's really what we're talking about here when we're studying through books of the Bible, is that it's one continuous story and thought. And when you learn to appreciate it that way, you get it a little bit more in your mind, and you can recall those passages easier in your life, and that'll help you. That'll help you so much. All right. That being said, let's just go through a short summary of what we've been studying in Colossians. Colossians chapter 1. We talked about the gospel and those who receive it. They're bearing fruit and increasing. So the gospel, Paul says in chapter 1, it has spread throughout all the world. It has taken root in you. And what the gospel is doing in the world is that it bears fruit and it increases. It grows and it produces things. And basically, when it takes root in you, you bear fruit and you increase in the knowledge of the will of God. And Paul says that is what we have been praying for you guys, specifically. We want you to know, to be enriched in all wisdom, to understand the will of God. We want you to know His ways so that you can walk in them, so that you can bear fruit, that you can live the way that God wants you to live. And because you are living as God wants you to live, and as you learn what God wants for you, you are going to be steadfast. You are going to be patient. And you are going to be thankful. He wants those things for them because in chapter 2, he learns that there are people, very persuasive people, who are trying to offer them another way than the gospel. In chapter 2, he talks about people who are inflated by their fleshly lusts in their mind, and they delight in the worship of angels, self-abasement, a self-made religion of self-righteousness. And these people are trying to lure the Colossian Christians away. They're trying to offer them something more. And Paul's simple argument against that, it seems, is, what more could you want? In the lesson, when we were going through chapter 2, you might remember this. I used an illustration about if you were invited to the birthday party of the richest man in the world, you were expected to bring a gift. All right, what would you give him? What could you possibly give the richest man in the world that could be worth 5 minutes of his time? And the fact is, if you emptied your bank account, if you pooled all of your resources among probably all of us, we probably still wouldn't be able to afford something that could really be worth that guy's time. And so the same thing should be true of us. If we see that we are the richest, that we have been blessed through Jesus with everything that we could want, then why would we be tempted by someone saying that they could offer us more if we follow their way of serving God, a way other than the one that Christ has given to us? Another interesting thing to see in chapter 2 is that Paul doesn't highlight a specific doctrine that is being pushed here exactly. He highlights the different ways false doctrine could appear and the ways that it could look, but not by name does he mention anything specific as far as a name goes. And really what you'll find is that the things that he lists as being kind of trademarks of this false doctrine can apply to pretty much any false doctrine. Whether it's Judaizing teachers or whether it's Gnosticism or some other kind of pagan idea. And really, I think what some of they're struggling with is Judaizing teachers, which we'll get to in chapter 4. Chapter 3, Paul encourages them to keep seeking the things above, living Christ-centered lives, making sure that your vision is securely focused on Christ, on reaching the goal of heaven, to be with Him. You have died and your life is hidden with Christ. But that sounds really lofty. That sounds like a really big ideal, kind of unattainable in a way. But at the end of chapter 3, he starts talking about what that looks like in a life. It talks about husbands loving your wives, wives being subject to your husbands, about children, be obedient to your parents, fathers, don't exasperate your children. Simple things. In the family, in your household, this is the way that a Christ-centered life lives and looks like. And then he talks about slaves and masters. And slaves and masters are going to be an important thing because we're going to talk about two characters, Philemon and Onesimus, in chapter 4. With that being said, let's start and just read through the entire chapter of Colossians 4. Masters, grant to your slaves justice and fairness, knowing that you too have a master in heaven. Devote yourselves to prayer, keeping alert in it with an attitude of thanksgiving, praying at the same time for us as well, that God will open up to us a door for the Word, so that we may speak forth the mystery of Christ, for which I have also been imprisoned, that I may make it clear in the way I ought to speak. Conduct yourselves with wisdom toward outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. As to all my affairs, Tychicus, our beloved brother and faithful servant and fellow bondservant in the Lord, will bring you information. For I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know about our circumstances and that he may encourage your hearts. And with him Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of your number. They will inform you about the whole situation here. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, sends you his greetings, and also Barnabas' cousin Mark, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And also Jesus, who is called Justus. These are the only fellow workers for the kingdom of God who are from the circumcision, and they have proved to be an encouragement to me. Epaphras, who is one of your number, bondslave of Jesus Christ, sends you his greetings, always laboring earnestly for you in his prayers, that you may stand perfect and fully assured in all the will of God. For I testify for him that he has a deep concern for you, and for those who are in Laodicea and Hierapolis. Luke, the beloved physician, sends you his greetings, and also Demas. Greet the brethren who are in Laodicea, and also Nympha and the church that is in her house. And when this letter is read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and you, for your part, read my letter that is coming from Laodicea. Say to Archippus, take heed to the ministry which you have received in the Lord, that you may fulfill it. I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. Remember my imprisonment. Grace be with you. So the first section I'd like to tackle here is verses 2 through 6. After Paul gets done describing to them what a Christ-centered life looks like, masters, slaves, parents, children, husbands, wives, he asks something from them personally. He asks them to devote themselves to prayer. And he says, keeping alert in it with an attitude of thanksgiving. See, I don't think this is much of a subject change from what he was talking about before. When he was talking about everybody and how their life was supposed to look like when it's Christ-centered. This is just a continuation of that. Devote yourselves to prayer. And really, if we look throughout the book, that's kind of the language that is being used, is that praying is hard work. If you look at Colossians chapter 1, verse 9, he says, since the day we heard of it, we have not ceased to pray for you, and to ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of His will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding. We have not ceased to pray for you. In chapter 2, verse 1, I want you to know how great a struggle I have on your behalf, and for those who are at Laodicea, and for all those who have not personally seen my face. Of course, what kind of struggle is he talking about? You could probably make the argument that he's not talking about prayer, but I think just reading through and how he talks about it, it sounds like the struggle is prayer. Certainly it includes prayer. He's struggling with them in prayer, and I think it connects to what Epaphras is doing. In verse 12, it says, Epaphras is always laboring earnestly for you in his prayers, because he has a deep concern for them. Prayer is hard work. And we need to see it that way. We need to be willing to work, to labor earnestly for ourselves, for our brethren, that we devote ourselves to prayer like we should. Well, there's a specific command in this. Not just pray, but keep alert in it with an attitude of thanksgiving. And what does that mean? What does that mean? One way of taking that is to see it as Him commanding us to never take things for granted, and to always notice the things that we should be thankful for, that we should stay alert about it. I think that's true. I think we can go even further with that, though. Is there a way in which gratitude keeps us safe? Is there a way in which gratitude protects us and serves as a safeguard? Kind of connects back to what was being said in chapter 2 about seeing that we have been given all that we could want. What could tempt us beyond that? You wouldn't think of gratitude as one of the main tools in overcoming false teaching and false doctrine, but I would suggest otherwise. I think it is. Then Paul asks for prayers specifically for them. That God will open up to them a door for the word, that they may speak forth the mystery of Christ, for which I have been imprisoned. And I think we could pray for that as well. Pray not only for opportunities for the gospel to be spread, but also pray for the ability to be able to spread the gospel as we should. I always wondered about this because this is Paul, the Apostle Paul, and he was asking for prayers that he would be able to say the gospel as he should, that he would have the ability to be able to speak the gospel. You think Paul would have a pretty good handle on that, right? How many people has he taught? How many times has he spoken this gospel? I mean, if anybody knew how to speak forth the gospel as one should, it would be Paul, right? And yet here he is, and he's asking for prayers. Please pray for me, that I could say what I need to. I think that makes it more evident to us that we need to pray the same thing for us, for ourselves, and for those spreading the gospel. We may think, no, we've got it down. We may think we know what to say, but we need to pray about it. Because Paul did. Verse 5 and 6, about speaking toward outsiders, spreading the gospel with people. He says, conduct yourselves with wisdom toward them, and make the most of the opportunity. Some versions may say, making the most of the time, or redeeming the time. You know what you call it when you're around someone who isn't a Christian? You call that an opportunity. And I wish I could say something to you guys about what you should say. when you come across somebody who doesn't know the gospel. I wish I could give you guys the perfect lesson plan about how you're supposed to talk to people who are outside of Christ, and what exactly you're supposed to say to win them over. I wish I could help you guys in that way, but I don't know that. And the fact is that there's no specific guide. There are no specific words that we're supposed to use. And really, all the passage says is conduct yourselves with wisdom. Every situation is going to be different. Every time you speak to someone about the gospel, it's going to be different. They're coming from a different place, and you've got the limited opportunity with them, or maybe not. Use wisdom. Where do we get that wisdom, though? Chapter 2. Verse 2. God's mystery, that is Christ Himself, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. He's talking about wisdom and knowledge, and it comes from Christ. If you want to know how to talk to people about Christ, if you want to know how to do that with wisdom, then look at how Jesus did it. I think that's a pretty good lesson from Colossians. Verse 6, let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. Now, what does he mean? Seasoned with salt. The best I could figure is, if you were going to prepare a meal for somebody, which one would be easier? If you just threw a bunch of ingredients from the bag onto the frying pan, or if you followed a recipe? It would probably be easier to just throw ingredients onto a frying pan, right? Which one do you think would taste better? Probably the recipe, right? When you take time to prepare your words, not that you're following a script every time, but that with wisdom you are measuring what you should say to somebody, then you are seasoning your words with salt. You are preparing it as you would a meal, and you are making it palatable. You're trying to reason with them and make the most of the opportunity. Beyond that, he goes on about Tychicus. He's sending him to the Colossians. He's going to bring the Colossians information about Paul. And that hopefully, whatever it is about Paul's circumstances will encourage the Colossians. Whether he is, at this time, he is in chains. And so we have to assume that's kind of going to be the message that Tychicus is going to bring to the Colossians. Paul is in prison. But he's hoping that the outcome of that news is going to be encouragement for the Colossians. I just want to appreciate that for one moment. That's not very happy circumstances, not for Paul. And yet Paul is happy in those circumstances. And he is in chains for the gospel. He said that before in chapter 1 at the end. And he said that even in this chapter. So he wants them to be encouraged about that. He is in chains for the gospel, and he is teaching the gospel. He's also sending Onesimus. Onesimus is also going to tell them about the whole situation here. Now, there's a book in the New Testament called Philemon. It doesn't have any chapters in it. It's a very short book. And Philemon is written to Philemon from Paul. And Philemon would have been carried along with this letter to the Colossians, because Philemon is, I believe, a part of this church in Colossae. The interesting thing about Philemon is that he had a slave, and that slave's name was Onesimus. Onesimus ran away from Philemon. Onesimus was not a Christian. He ran away, and back then, under Roman law, that was not a crime that was, well, going to be excused. But when Onesimus ran away, he came across Paul, by chance, I guess. And Paul taught him the gospel. Onesimus became a Christian. Now, in this situation, as a slave who has fled from his master, what is the right thing to do? You've become a Christian. You've renounced all dishonesty, all sin. What do you do? Paul tells Onesimus, go back to your master. Make things right with Philemon. Now there's a threat here, because under Roman law, Onesimus could die. But he goes back to Philemon. Philemon is encouraged to lay aside his feelings as a slave owner and to instead regard his duty to Onesimus as a brother higher than his feelings as a slave owner. Paul says Onesimus is your brother now, and you should accept him as your brother. And even in the context of Colossians, how are brothers supposed to regard one another? In chapter 3, verse 13, or starting in verse 12, as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another, forgiving each other. Whoever has a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. And that's our lesson to us. Is that no matter what happens between us, our duty to each other, as brethren, as members of the same household, should always come before whatever problem comes up in between that. That should always stay to the forefront of our minds whenever we are dealing with each other in any kind of capacity. Just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. Then he talks about Epaphras. And Epaphras was already mentioned in chapter 1. Epaphras was the person who brought the gospel to the Colossians in the first place. And he says, Epaphras says hi, and he's laboring earnestly for you in his prayers. And what is he praying? He's praying that you may stand perfect and fully assured in all the will of God. The exact same prayer that was being prayed in chapter 1. So if you have noticed, the letter is kind of coming full circle here. But let me ask you this. If you were going to pray for Colossae, based on what you know about the church at this point, just kind of going through the book, what would your prayer be for them? You know that they're struggling with some false teachers. We know that there could be some danger between Philemon and Onesimus. It seems like the entire church meets in Philemon's house. You could pray that God would take away the false teachers from around them. But instead, Instead, what is being asked for on their behalf is that they may know all the will of God. And that's about as good of a prayer as you could ask for the people in this circumstance. See, when I pray for people, I tend by habit to pray that the negative things be taken away. Not that they would have the strength to go through the negative things, and that they would grow, and that they would know the will of God and be stronger. I think that might be a wrong way of thinking about it. We need to pray, not for the trials to go away, not for the temptations to go away, but that our brethren would be strong enough to overcome it. Then at the end of the chapter, Luke says hi, Demas says hi, say hi to the brethren, Laodicea and Nympha. Read the letter that's coming from Laodicea. So, I think what's really interesting is that Paul had not met the Laodiceans, and I don't think he had met the Colossians. And yet, he's writing encouragements to them. And he's doing all he can. He's praying for them. He's struggling for them. Even though he hasn't even met them, he doesn't know who they are. And yet he's going through all of that just to try and help. He says, hi. Don't know who you are. Throughout this chapter, there's kind of a theme of brotherly concern, brotherly love, that really needs to be observed. Talking about between Philemon, Onesimus, the example of Epaphras. Talk about being thoughtful and how we're supposed to talk to people about the gospel. There's a level of concern that should be had among God's people for the brethren in the church. And it's challenging to me. All right. Well, I'm running out of time. Brotherly concern is what we have here. And at this point in the lesson, I'd like to offer an invitation for any brother or sister here who is struggling with something, who wants help from the Christians here. All you have to do is reach out. All you have to do is say, hey, I need prayers and I need help. We'd be more than glad to do that for you guys. Or if there are people here who aren't Christians and you want to become a Christian, you want to be baptized. The song we sang before this lesson, It Is Well With My Soul. I remember how hard it was to sing that song before I was a Christian. To really say the words, It is well with my soul. To think about the coming of the Lord and how happy I'm supposed to be about that, and yet how challenging it is because I'm not a Christian. If any of that crosses your mind as you're singing that song, then I'd like to invite you to come forward as we stand and sing the invitation song.